What our topic today is an introduction to, as Grant said, our work. And our belief at Pacific Educational Group is absolutely that this work is most effective when it's systemic. So what I'd like to do is just to spend a little bit of time today talking about how we get at this business of systemic equity transformation, what that looks like, what the levels of support that we offer are, and really an orientation to our work. On this slide here, you see our belief statement, and we're going to talk a bit about this idea of systemic racism in a bit, specifically what that means. Our vision, that our goal, frankly, is to create environments where our children, all of our children across racial difference, especially the students who are being consistently the least served in our systems, are experiencing an empowering educational experience and are being educated by educators who are racially conscious. Going back to Grant's point of what does race have to do with this, frankly, what we find across the country is that we have a lot of learning to do. We exist in a society that doesn't encourage this conversation about race and has kind of a patterned response to those who bring it. And so our charge as educators, from a moral imperative and as human beings, when our districts and our data and the experiences of our families and students is clearly indicating that, in fact, race does have something quite profound to do with the way that children and families experience our school systems, is to usher in this conversation, even when, for many of us, it's an uncomfortable conversation to have. But in doing so, what our experience has been is that the transformation that can occur in districts in terms of not only the relationship among staff members, but with families and students is equally rewarding. And then lastly, you see our core values as a company of unconditional love, consciousness, freedom, and collectivism, and interdependence. This is how we operate, and kind of the core values that undergird our work. Okay, and so with this work, we are firmly of the belief that this business of educational equity is always a personal journey. And so our work is always kind of resides at three levels: the personal, professional, and organizational level. So I'll start by modeling and giving a little bit of personalization about what we call our racial autobiography, or a little bit about ourselves and who we are as racial beings. This gentleman you see here is my paternal grandfather, Zoilo Versalles. He was an Afro-Cuban male, and our family came to the United States in the early 60s to Cuba. So my grandfather essentially raised, along with my mother and father, my brother and sister and I. And specifically when I think of my grandfather Zoilo, I think of the bilingualism that he's left with me, the biliteracy. He's a very religious man, so, reading the Bible in Spanish, reading Bible stories in Spanish, writing responses in Spanish, and so forth. So there's Zoilo. Here's another grandfather of mine I did not have an opportunity to meet, my grandfather Ramon, on my mother's side of the family. And as you can see, Ramon is a white Cuban male. In the photo you can't really see it, but he has green eyes. The boy to his right is my uncle Ramon, who currently lives in Miami, where most of our family lives. And this is my beloved abuela Tete, my grandmother Teresa, who I always remember this way, very much the matriarch of the family, loved kids and surrounded by kids at all times. And abuela Tete, as you can see, is also an Afro-Cuban woman. So two Afro-Cuban grandparents, two white Cuban grandparents. So our family is very much a mixed racial family, as is the case in most of Cuban society. Okay, and so then the question comes, well, what are you doing in Minnesota? All right, and so the short answer is baseball. My father's brother, Zoilo Jr., when he was 16, was drafted by the Washington Senators, came to the United States, played minor league baseball, and at the age of 19 made his debut in Major League Baseball, and was able to bring his father, Zoilo Sr., and my dad, Lázaro, with him. And so our family landed in the Twin Cities. And the reason I share this story is not only just to personalize a bit and provide some of my racial autobiography, but also because I believe it's a very important connection to this conversation we're having around educational equity. Please understand that my uncle and my father grew up extremely poor in Cuba. And so when my uncle came to the United States and made it to the major leagues and was able to support a family, beautiful wife, 6 beautiful daughters, you could kind of understand how he might start to believe, I kind of made it, I did it. And so it wasn't until he had interactions with a specific coach who really put on his mind that, yes, sir, well, you've done a lot of things and you're a good player, but have you considered that if you approached the work differently, if you really challenged some of these beliefs around making it or having made it, that you could have a whole different level of success. And as a matter of fact, I'm of the belief that you could actually be the best player in the world, best shortstop in the world. And that's actually my expectation for you. This is early 60s, so never have been a Latin American most valuable player. So my uncle's kind of hearing this saying, yeah, okay, I get it. He kind of kept on and kept on and so forth. And over time, that message really started to take hold. So anyone know who this gentleman is in the middle? Baseball people? Billy Martin. Yep, absolutely. So Billy Martin, among many things he's known for, is absolutely a pretty brilliant mind in baseball, and actually spoke some Spanish, which made a difference as well. And so the reason I offer this is because of Billy's coaching, if you will, and insistence that there was a different level of capacity there. In fact, my uncle did start to approach his work differently, to organize and prepared and dedicated himself in different ways, and was able to achieve in 1965 becoming the first Latin American most valuable player in the history of Major League Baseball. And then, of course, in 65 from the National League, you have the incomparable Willie Mays. And so all of this to say, I find it strikingly similar to a lot of the narrative of the challenge of educating students to a high level in an equitable way. And we're of the belief that this transformation is actually possible. We see pockets of this work occurring at a high level, and we know that the commitment level of the leadership, the ways that folks organize and prioritize their work and reframe this issue of what is really contributing to the disparity that we see in achievement across racial difference, that is, frankly, what is necessary in order to bring forth a different outcome. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this process of systemic equity transformation looks like. Okay. In this process and in this conversation, as has been the case in many businesses and organizations that experience organizational change or changing environments, Ronald Heifetz offers a structure for what he calls adaptive leadership, which is essentially the ability of a leader to introduce enough tension or enough what he calls disequilibrium to really help folks understand that, quite frankly, the way we're doing things here isn't quite working. And that we've made some organizational assumptions, we've kind of adopted some organizational beliefs that aren't going to hit the mark given this changing environment. Okay, so in the context of education, certainly we're seeing very rapid demographic changes, and so what we're finding, as Grant mentioned, is that a lot of the ways that our systems have been normed from a perspective and an experience that is aligned with the dominant perspective isn't hitting the mark. Okay, and so bringing along that conversation, needless to say, is not an easy one. But as Heifetz would say, it's not a matter of whether or not it's uncomfortable, but to what degree are we able to manage this disequilibrium, if you will, and also take into consideration the amount of time needed for a change effort. So our work is really engaging our districts in this conversation of really holding this space for a productive zone of disequilibrium so that we can get to a more adaptive solution that really gets at the issue of educational disparity across race. Yeah, it's a messy graph, right? So the way, so to contextualize this, for example, in this context of the discussion around race and schooling, we have an education fallen into kind of a classic pattern of framing the issue as a technical issue. So it's really just a matter of finding the right discipline program or the right math curriculum or the right literacy curriculum and so forth. And so we have this organizational toll, emotional toll that happens as this roller coaster ride of as the disequilibrium increases, we're looking for that quick technical solution, that quick fix. Ooh, we feel better because we have a new math curriculum or we have a new discipline structure or so forth. And then, of course, this happens again. And so we hear back from our students, or I'm sorry, from our staff frequently, how many curricula are we going to have? And frankly, it's because we haven't done some of the heavy lifting, had some of the hard conversations that St. Paul Public Schools is centering. So the work then becomes organizationally, how do we center and provide support for these more difficult conversations, specifically around race, in a district where the achievement data is pretty clearly indicating that race and the way that students experience the district across race is problematic. So that hopefully gives some context as you look at all of this. So really, so what I'm going to speak to is a strategy that we engage our districts in to have this holding space. And one of the strategies we use is the strategy of courageous conversation about race, as the title of the book indicates. So our belief is that in order for us to, as organizations, get to a different level of consciousness around what race is, specifically what systemic racism is, and most importantly, how is that showing up in my school today, affecting my kids and our families. And also, am I actually, at the unconscious, unintentional level, actually contributing to this? In order to have those conversations, our experience has been that you need a protocol, you need a framework. And part of the framework are 4 agreements or norms. So the first norm is that we stay engaged. Historically, classically, in the United States, we've found lots of strategies to disengage conversations about race, a lot of conversation stoppers. So we need to find a way to stay engaged, not only from an intellectual standpoint, but really from an emotional standpoint as well. We all agree that because we're talking about race, which most scientists will concur is really a social construction, it's not a scientifically real phenomenon. So as grown, educated adults having a conversation about something that's really not real, that's going to be somewhat uncomfortable to talk about. So we just agree that we're all going to have some discomfort along the way for lots of reasons. But we don't actually view the discomfort as a problem. As a matter of fact, we acknowledge it for what it is, a sign that we're doing the work that we need to do. And by staying in that space of engagement and discomfort, what's true is we get to a different level of understanding, not only of ourselves, but of others as well. We need to be able to speak our truths and feel supported in doing so. A lot of the disconnect around race that we've seen historically has been really attributed to the fact that, frankly, folks don't feel that they're able to do that. And so in our work, we help folks understand that whether our educators are white or people of color, that they all have a racial lived experience, that this racial lived experience is equally valid. There's no right and wrong, and that we all need to be clear with what our experience and perspective has been. And so by speaking our truths, we get to a more authentic place of understanding, rather than speaking from a place of stereotypes or half-truths or mistruths, which only actually exacerbates the issue. And lastly, that we understand that this conversation about systemic racism is not something as simple as going back to the technical solution piece, that there is no technical solution. And that we can't kid ourselves into thinking that there is one, and that once we find that technical solution, everything will be great. That this is, in fact, an ongoing process of, again, really having some hard conversations with ourselves at the personal level, doing some introspection at the individual level, doing some introspection at the professional level and organizational level to answer that question, how is race really being lived in our school? And in what ways, again, is it possible that we, from an unconscious and unintentional standpoint even, create advantage and disadvantage? This is another slide that gives us some more language to this piece. So, our contention is that the organizational ability to center these norms is directly related to the ability of the organization to start to transform the experience of students, specifically students of color, but to improve actually the academic outcomes of all kids, including our white students. And so the leadership development is one of really making these norms a part of doing business in the schools so that the educators, families, students really can engage in this place. Okay, and so in this conversation around racism, frequently in the United States, the way race has kind of historically been constructed, when we hear that word racism, our first thought is to think of an extremely overt and damaging or destructive action that a person does to another person, or a comment, or a word, or an action. And so our work with school districts is really to help them understand what systemic racism is, and how it is that, again, hardworking, good, well-intentioned people, when they're not in a place of racial consciousness, in fact, can and do perpetuate systemic racism. So our belief is that, specifically in school districts where race is pretty clearly documented as being problematic, the organizational inability or unwillingness or lack of support for individuals trying to get at this conversation, which leaves all of the educators in this place of racial unconsciousness while the students continue to struggle, that, among all of the things that our children are faced with, and certainly, make no mistake about it, there are a number of factors that contribute to academic success and academic challenges, but the collective inability or unwillingness of adults, we adults, the ones who are responsible for the education of the children, to even have conversations, to be able to get to a place of taking appropriate action, that is, among all of the factors, the most devastating factor, contributing to the diminished capacity of all children, especially black children, to achieve at the highest levels, and leads to the fracturing of communities that support and nurture them. And in that definition, you'll notice that the word black is with a lowercase b. In other words, black is the adjective and not the noun, because what we find, again, consistently across the country is that the darkest complected students, be those students African American, African, Latino, what have you, those are the students that we tend to find are the least served in our systems. And that within any racial group we see a clear stratification from lightest to darkest in terms of achievement disparity. It's also our belief that, frankly, the business of educating all kids to high levels does not require a Herculean effort, contrary to what the movie industry would like us to believe, that teach kids that look like me, you've got to work 20 hours a day and be there on Saturday and go up against the administration and all that. It's not our belief. And that actually, that the knowledge and skills, as we see this quote from Dr. Asa Hilliard, one of the leading scholars in this work we lost several years ago back in 2007, that the knowledge and skills to educate all children already exist, but that because we have lived in a historically oppressive society, educational issues tend to be framed as technical issues, going back to that technical solution piece, which denies their political origin and meaning. And that there are no pedagogical barriers to teaching and learning when willing people are prepared and made available to children. If we embrace a will to excellence, we can deeply restructure education in ways that will enable teachers to release the full potential of all of our children. So we are squarely of the belief that this is a conversation about adults and systems. and the ways that organizations structure systems that are congruent with the belief that all children, in fact, will be successful. And in that process, what we find is that what we run up against frequently is our uncovered beliefs, our unexamined beliefs about what it is we really believe around racial difference and the ability of children of racial difference. Okay, when we have some pretty clear indication that this idea of belief is critical. You go back to the pre-Brown versus Board of Education era with a lot of the research that we have from that era with children of color, specifically Latino children in segregated schools, African American children at segregated schools. Proficiency levels were quite high, much higher than they are today. And so it's not really about the kids as much as we would like to frame it in that way. So in this conversation, we have a few assumptions, research-based assumptions that frame the work. That first of all, we need to be able to talk about race to be able to deal with racial disparities. For some time, we dealt with a gender gap in this country, and we had to be able to get to a place of saying boy and girl, and taking a hard look at what the experience of boys and girls in classrooms was, very specifically, to be able to impact that. And so similarly, in a racial disparity, we need to be able to have language to talk about race. That, in fact, systemic racism does not require intention or malice on anyone's part, but just rather that we remain unconscious about these sorts of things. And that, lastly, a teacher teaches his or her culture primarily, which is tied to your race and your racial lived experience, and that the grade level or subject matter that they teach comes secondary. So the implication being, if our educators are not clear about who they are, going back to the point that was made earlier, Grant's piece about, what are the assumptions that each of us bring, if we're not clear on what those assumptions are, it's pretty likely that those assumptions are going to show up in a way that, again, unintentionally, not from a place of malice or ill will, but just from a place of unconsciousness around this issue, will in fact create advantage and disadvantage to students across racial difference. Okay, and so as we really educate our educators around the system, this issue of systemic racism, this is a really helpful visual, I feel, which comes from not only education, but areas such as legal studies and healthcare and so forth, that helps kind of construct a helpful frame for understanding systemic racism. And what it offers is that, similar to the fact that in this society we have a number of different forms of social domination, for example, gender. I carry, in this society, certain privilege around gender all day, every day. And quite frankly, the society doesn't create a lot of space for me to dig deeper into that and to surface that. So I, as a male, not because I'm misogynist, not because I'm ill-willed, but by virtue of being a male, I might be a little more challenged in being able to identify that, certainly than my female counterparts. Okay, and so, I go to the Mall of America with my children and my wife, and we walk into Legoland, and my wife is like, oh, great. I'm like, what? She's like, well, clearly all of the more cognitively demanding Legos are marketed to boys, and all the cutesy, unsophisticated stuff is marketed to girls. No idea. So what we're saying in this conversation about how race has been socially constructed in the United States is that not because of, frankly, not because of their wanting it to be this way, that our white educators are, just as I am, more challenged in the conversation on gender equity, in a more problematic position to be able to identify some of these pieces, going back to Grant's conversation earlier. Okay, and so then the challenge of our white educators and leaders in this work is really combating this idea of what's called personally mediated racism, racism that's doled out or mediated by those who are in the dominant group to those who are not. Okay, and again, frequently, frankly, the majority of this occurs at the unintentional and unconscious level. Now, we all know some of this is very conscious and very intentional as well, But in the realm of education, frankly, that is not the majority of the issue, not our belief anyhow. For those of us who are people of color, our struggle with systemic racism comes from this place of what's called internalized racism. So in this society where certain value has been ascribed to those, specifically the white educators or white people in our society, in American society, people of color over time start to internalize certain messages. And frankly, these messages are reinforced in mass media. They're reinforced, and certainly in this day and age, our kids, every time they open the newspaper, they turn on the internet, they turn their television set, our kids of color are reminded that they're in some way the problem. And so, similar to, again, as a parent of 2 children, I don't think I'm going to leave the business of helping my children understand issues like sex education up to what they get in mass media. Similarly, in this conversation about race, the damaging messages that kids of color receive, if unattended to and not combated with positive messages about being pride, having developing pride for their racial identity, we can kind of get a sense of where that would go. For our white students, again, our challenge is to help them better understand how to exist in a multicultural, pluralistic society, not from a place of superiority, but of solidarity. Specifically, when we consider that our students, our white students and students of color in our schools today, for the majority of their lives, they will live in a country where most of the folks are going to be people of color. So this is the work for our colleagues of color, is to combat this internalized racism, which again helps hold up systemic racism. So tying this to education, this is the conversation of our kids of color in the hallway saying, "Oh, you're not going to college. You're going to college." And we all know who the "they" is. Okay, and so helping unpack, how is it that African American students could have that comment when universities originated in Africa? So where does this thinking come from? We think about the education of Latino students, and the preponderance of research. It's very clear that the highest performing Latino students not only are able to academically be successful and connected to family and so forth in English, but also in Spanish. And when we have policies and very direct policies that prohibit them from using Spanish and so forth. These are aspects of internalized racism that impact in a negative way. Okay, and so then our work at PEG is to elevate the racial consciousness of the white educators, the educators of color, so that when they come together in an institution like a school, their racial consciousness is such that the policies, procedures, interactions, and so forth that they have with students and families are not damaging, not destructive, and are not contributing to the disparities that we see. Okay, and certainly you get enough institutions, businesses, churches, schools, so forth in a society that are racially unconscious, we have this phenomenon called systemic racism. So our contention is that of all of these factors, our inability to see and grapple with and interrupt systemic racism, that is what's devastating. So as we work through this process, it becomes very clear that random acts of equity and pockets of excellence cannot address a systemic issue, and that you need a systemic response, systemic intervention, if you will, to get at a systemic challenge. So I want to share a little bit about the framework that we use. In our framework, our students are centered, and really the conversation then is organizationally engaging our districts in a conversation of, to what degree are the students centered in this district? To what degree are conversations around learning and teaching? And we put those words in that order because we're of the firm belief that something can't be taught unless learning is occurring, and we need learning to occur for teaching to occur. This idea that I taught it, they just didn't teach, you just didn't learn it, it doesn't really make sense. That the conversations around what leadership's role is in acting in a way that continually has race on the table and is answering that question, what does race have to do with what we're seeing? Most importantly, how are we providing advantage or disadvantage, and what can we do about that? And is also entering into partnership with family and community in ways that many of our districts haven't previously, specifically family and community of color, and really acting in a way that gets at issues of empowerment that go beyond involvement and engagement. So throughout this process, by engaging all of these different constituent and stakeholder groups in this work, that we have an opportunity to get to an equitable outcome. And very simply, our definition of equity is raising the achievement of all of our students while narrowing the gaps between the highest and lowest performing groups, and also eliminating the racial predictability and disproportionality of those which occupy the highest and lowest categories. Okay, so this conversation is not a zero-sum game. This is about improving the educational experience of all kids in the United States. The federal government knows the urgency of this work, and I think is trying to communicate as loudly and clearly to us as they can that we need to do this work. We need to get this right, and that, frankly, a lot of our developed nations, counterparts, are doing this and accelerating this work in a faster rate. Okay, so this is about really improving the experience of all of our students. And so in addition to this piece, the training we provide is first of all in providing a skill and ability to talk about race. And our experience is that for an organization, for a school district, for example, the size of St. Paul Public Schools, to be able to equip the educators with the ability to have conversations about race that are productive and insightful, you need a protocol. And so the protocol that we've created for those conversations is called Courageous Conversation About Race Protocol. Those are those 4 agreements that I just shared with you, and I'll share a bit about the 6 conditions that fall into that protocol as well. We also need to give our educators a knowledge base about what race is, specifically how systemic racism works, and the knowledge base that theorizes, organizes, provides a schema for this that we use as critical race theory, which is based around 5 tenets of systemic racism, and most importantly, is framed from a perspective of what can we do as responsible adults charged with educating all children to interrupt these pattern ways that racism can surface in our schools. We also engage the organizations in a conversation around systems thinking, and really specifically understanding the relationship between our beliefs, the structures that we create in our schools, the patterns and trends we see in data, and our outcomes. And specifically, we engage with a couple of tools around Peter Senge's work in this area, really that in-depth introspection around, that idea of beliefs. How do I get to my beliefs around racial difference? What's that about? Is that about stereotypes, or is that about real lived experience? And by practicing courageous conversation, we create this safe space for educators to provide different perspectives so that the organization can get to a different level of understanding around how race is lived. And throughout this process, we need to be clear on our ability to lead from an anti-racist perspective, to be clear about the conscious, ongoing, deliberate actions that need to be taken, and the ability to really suspend that productive zone of disequilibrium that I showed you earlier, so that the conversation stays front and center, and so that we get to those adaptive solutions rather than trying to seek that easy way out, the technical solution. So our contention is that when school districts are able to engage everyone in the organization in the fullness of this framework, we have an opportunity, and it's reasonable to believe that racial disparities will be eliminated. But make no mistake that this is a systemic issue, which requires a systemic response. And so frankly, my joy is that in my job I get to work closely with superintendents like Superintendent Silva, school board members like the board members here in St. Paul, district administrators, such as the group of district leaders you have in St. Paul, and principals at the building level to really help them make sense of this leadership process. And this work tends to attract a pretty high caliber individual. It tends to weed out mediocrity in a hurry. And that's very inspiring to be around. Because, again, this is the highest form of leadership, and this is the most urgent work that we can be doing as educators. This is just a piece that I think is important for us to keep in mind. And this is just a couple of data sets. One from the College Board, SAT data, and this is actually ACT data from the state of Ohio. And one of the trends, we're not going to spend a lot of time here for purposes of time, but there is this desire to want to ascribe the nature of this challenge around racial disparity to poverty. And make no mistake about it, poverty is a significant impact and input that I think we need to be thoughtful about as educators. But what's interesting is not only in this data, but in data, frankly, in the Twin Cities and across the country, we see a pattern of our poorer students when we control for poverty. We see the gaps emerge. Okay, so if, for example, we look at our students who are free reduced lunch students, we see a gap between our white students and our students of color. Conversely, in very affluent communities of color, we see gaps between our very affluent white students and very affluent students of color. Even deeper yet, in many districts in the Twin Cities, we see that our poorer white students outperform middle-class students of color. So I just offer that as an indication that, as Grant mentioned, there is absolutely something to the cultural link, piece of assumptions, and the way that students experience schooling across racial difference that is much deeper than simple economic differences. In addition to poverty, things like family support are places where folks want to go. Language, another place we like to go. And mobility is a place we like to go. And so when we dig deeper and actually look at these factors, we find that actually there's something else going on, and that, in fact, race does have something to do with this. So rather than saying that these things aren't real, our interest is more in engaging a conversation of taking all of these factors into consideration, simply asking and answering the question, what does race have to do with this? So how is it different to be a poor student of color as opposed to a poor white student in St. Paul Public Schools? What has been the experience that we've seen around family support? And what assumptions are we bringing to this idea of family support? Okay, going back to our family and Cuban society, you do not go into the school and start telling the teachers what to do. So we have a lot of assumptions around what the right way to be engaged in education are. And quite frankly, Cuba has the highest literacy rate in the world. Are they wrong? No, I don't think we can say that. Right? So just really challenging some assumptions we make. Language, one of, frankly, my biggest interests is, what I call the miseducation of our students who come into our system with more than one language. And when our structures, going back to structures, are organized in such a way that the end game is to give them what we feel is best for our English monolingual speaking students, that's a problem. And we are missing a tremendous resource nationally that we need to develop in a very powerful way. And mobility. Again, many times districts kind of go to this place of, well, if we could just keep our kids. And then they actually go to the work of collecting cohort data and see that, frankly, sometimes your mobile population is outperforming the kids you kept. Okay, so we need to really examine where these narratives come from, which keep us in this place of racial unconsciousness, and simply get to the place of saying, we can be racially conscious and understand poverty. We can be racially conscious and understand family support, language, and mobility. It's not an either or. Okay, and so in the context of the conversations that we help guide, we use some conditions. The agreements, if you will, are kind of the how we ask folks to show up for the conversation around race. The conditions are the what. And so very quickly, we focus on our personal, local, and immediate context for race. So I shared a little bit of mine. So growing up, in Cuban society, if you look like me, you're called Havao. So my parents, when I was a kid, they just as easily, they interchangeably use the word Havao. So they just as easily, instead of saying, Oye, Luis, ven acá, Luis, come over here, they could literally say, Oye, Havao, ven acá. And it was just always that present in our household. And so descriptors of race in Latin American culture are very prevalent. But it's very powerful for me to have a conversation with my father years into this work and say, I'm fine with it. It doesn't, was never a problem for me, but I'm just curious, why do you think you always call me hello? I don't know, you just do. Well, I want you to think about that. Okay. So he came back a few weeks later with tears in his eyes, and we had this very impactful conversation about, his experiences in Cuba being darker complected, and some of the racism he faced, and some of the racism that existed, frankly, in his family. In a family where his father was Afro-Cuban and his mother was white. And the experience around the family, and descriptive, my father integrated some amateur baseball, Cuban amateur baseball leagues. And his experience was, watching his white teammates go into a club and eat a meal after a baseball game, and they'd bring some food out to him, and he'd eat the meal on the bus. And so what he came to was a realization, because I'm lighter complected than my dad, and saying, I guess my way of continually calling you Havao was my way of telling myself my son's going to have it better than me. And so this is the point, is how race is always kind of swimming around, but we don't get to this level of consciousness and complexion with it. So we really train the educators to isolate race and answer the question. Sure, a lot of things have to do with a lot of things, but what does race specifically have to do with this specific situation? Because race is not real, it's a social construction, we need to be able to better understand this socially constructed phenomenon. So we talk about things from different racial perspectives rather than just our own. We monitor those 4 agreements I shared with you earlier and really ask ourselves, am I willing to hear this different perspective? Am I willing to experience some discomfort? Am I wanting to disengage? Am I being truthful? Am I creating space for others to speak their truth? All of that. And really establishing some parameters to be able to better hear one another's voices. We use a working definition for race, which is actually distinguished from ethnicity and nationality, which are kind of pieces that we tend to like to conflate with race. So we like to be able to say, well, I'm Cuban American, and Cameron Diaz is Cuban American as well. When I walk down the street, Cameron Diaz walks down the street, a little different, slightly different. And lastly, we examine the role and presence of whiteness, which is a manifestation of social dominance around race. Whiteness being a way of being, thinking, and believing, and acting that's normed from a dominant perspective, and which both people of color and white colleagues can show up in, specifically when we're not attending to our racial consciousness. So this is just a brief review of the framework, of the Courageous Conversation framework. Again, we talk about helping our educators understand, beyond just the simple amount of melanin in your hair, skin, and eyes, what race really means from a cultural perspective in terms of being, feeling, and acting, and how does that show up in a classroom, for example? How does that show up in your leadership? How does that show up in your interactions and the ways that you create opportunities and space for families and community members to be empowered? And also the idea of racial identity development, again, understanding that we're all works in progress and we're all working toward, again, better developing our racial identity development, again, for our students of color, to really give them a sense of pride in who they are, and for our white students, a sense of solidarity, And frankly, some of the most powerful work I've seen is with our students, middle school, high school kids who are just running with this. And so it's the same process we engage our educators in as well. In terms of classroom applications, my ultra-talented colleague, Marlicia Autry, works with educators across the country on a process that we call CARE, which is grounded in 7 principles of equity or anti-racist pedagogy. Starts with the process of being clear about expectations, being clear about what equity is, that definition of all students improving, students of color and our white students, narrowing gaps, eliminating racial predictability of the highest and lowest performing students, through the practice of courageous conversation, getting to different levels of insight about classroom practice, decentering these aspects of whiteness that are rooted in the dominant perspective. These ideas are in the book, universal perspective, individualism, avoidance, and decontextualization, which we can talk more about later if folks have questions about that. And then really engaging in a process with a cadre of educators around action research for equity, which we call CARE, Collaborative Action Research for Equity. This process of inquiry and action research that the principles are critical in supporting. We work from the frameworks of founders in the work of culturally relevant instruction, such as Geneva Gay's work around her 4 R's of realness, rigor, relevance, and relationships, and some of Sternen's work about trying to identify who in the building is, frankly, very effective with kids of color and what's happening in those classrooms and how can we amplify that so that more of our educators are practicing in that way. And quickly review a framework that gives us a sense of all of the different levels of the programming that Grant alluded to earlier. So in addition to our foundational training Beyond Diversity that some of you might be familiar with, which is a 2-day experience that essentially gives folks kind of a constructivist experience that proves that we can have productive and safe conversations about race across racial difference. In addition to that, we're of the belief that the equity leadership development needs to be occurring at the top of the district, so it's school board, principals and administrators, district coordinators, needs to be reflected in policies, data analysis, and also the crafting of a strategic plan. We engage with a group of district equity leadership called the DELT, District Equity Leadership Team, which gets developed in putting forth not only the plan, but supporting the buildings as they move forward with the work. So in that process, we move forward to equity team development at each building, led by the principal, and the equity team is essentially responsible for guiding the professional learning communities around equity work, organizational equity. As an aspect or arm of that programming, we provide specific support to staff of color to be not only a place of support, but also of leadership development, collaboration, empowerment. In phase 3, this is that CARE team process, that classroom action research piece that I alluded to earlier. Okay, so typically what happens is some of the members of the equity team branch into the CARE team. We bring on some new members of the equity team and continue on. And then as the educators have been developed, we really move into this place of parent engagement and empowerment, specifically with parents of color. So frequently what happens is we'll have some of the equity team members and CARE members who will form a PASS, a Partnership for Academically Successful Students group with representation from both the staff and parents and community. And then lastly, this piece of student leadership development that I alluded to earlier, specifically mostly at the middle school and high school level, which we call SOAR, Students Organized Against for Anti-Racism. And again, that is truly remarkable to behold the level of conversation of our students and their readiness. And Dan alluded to the Trayvon Martin tragedy, and we see our kids across the country wanting to get at this issue. and understand it, and not, frankly, having the tools that they need, perhaps, to get at it. So once given the opportunity and the tools, it's remarkable to see that emerge. So that is just a quick review of our work, the different levels of our work at Pacific Educational Group. And I'd like to close this with a quote. So if I could ask one of our participants to read the top section of the quote, and another participant to read the bottom section, just to remind us of what this is about and what it is that is at stake in this work. So invite a voice, brave soul. That's right. Another voice, the bottom paragraph. Thank you. This is Meredith, thank you for that. This is Meredith Marin's work in her case study of high school students in California and her book, Class Dismissed. And so I'd like to end with that clear reminder that this is about our students and their future and our future. And that, quite frankly, as we look at the changing demographics of our country, what's true is if students of color are not achieving in the United States, that will mean students are not achieving in the United States. This is, again, from my perspective, the most important work I will do in my career. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to share our work and to meet all of you, like-minded, passionate folks who are all driving for the same goals. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.